Governor Deval Patrick took part in a ceremony this morning at the State House 50 years after the assassination of JFK. The governor laid a wreath at the base of the JFK statue. The Kennedy family set an example of courage in the days after the president was shot in Dallas. Ted Kennedy had brief remarks. He directed them to the American people.
Senator Kennedy?
I would just like to say a word. I'm going down to Washington now with my mother and my sister Eunice. I do want to say how appreciative that both my parents have been for the tremendous outpouring of thoughtfulness and prayers that have come from all Americans in all parts of the country, from every religious group. And this has been a matter which has been a source of tremendous consolation to both my parents, and they certainly wanted me to express their great thanks to all of the people who have been so kind in remembering them now.
Senator
Thank you very
Kennedy.
much, Senator.
Thank you.
Can't even imagine. I'm joined now by Thomas P. O'Neill III. He leads the public relations firm O'Neill & Associates, served as Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts from 77 to 87. William Delahunt is a former Massachusetts congressman from the South Shore. He's the vice chair of the board of advisors at Harvard's JFK School of Government, the Institute of Politics. Gentlemen, good to see you both. Bill, starting with you, what do you remember from 50 years ago to today?
I happened to be in Rome, and I had just finished my active duty in the Coast Guard. I was a student at an international dormitory, and I was one of maybe 2 or 3 Americans out of maybe 300 or 400.
There he is in the Coast Guard in those days. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a picture.
Yeah, it is.
I walked in, and there were people milling around in the foyer, and as I walked in, I had got to know a lot of the students there. The place went silent. A Russian came up to see me, and in Italian he said, Kennedy è morto. And at that point in time, my Italian was fluent. It just didn't connect. And he could see I was bewildered. And he said to me, Kennedy è assassinato. I then grabbed another American, an Arab-American woman from New York. We got on a motorcycle that I had. We drove up to the American embassy. There were hundreds of thousands of people, Italians, in the street carrying candles.
Mourning JFK.
Mourning JFK.
Tom O'Neill, you were back on this side of the Atlantic. Where were you?
I was a student at Boston College, and it was like yesterday, sitting in the stands at McHugh Forum with 2 friends just talking about the night's activities, and somebody came by, a student came by and said, the president's been shot. And we didn't know whether to believe it or not, and within 30 seconds somebody else came by and said, he's not only been shot, he's been assassinated.
And a couple of days later, you were standing next to your father, who I read the other day first met JFK when he was running for Congress and supported the opponent, I should say, in that particular race. How did your father take this? I mean, he was a sitting member of Congress. He wasn't Speaker for another decade and a half. How did he take this?
He, well, first of all, he replaced John Kennedy in his congressional seat in Cambridge. And I think there was no difference between the way my dad took it than the rest of the world, to be very honest with you. And it was stunning, is how he took it. And it was the same way a whole generation took it. You weren't supposed to take this young man, this vibrancy, away from anybody, and it was taken from the world. You've both spent your life in and around politics. Did JFK leave a lasting impact on American politics or just on the American people, Tom O'Neill? Oh, I think he laid I think he left an awful lot, not only to the American people, and not only to the people who find themselves in the business he was in, but to people all over the world. I said this last night. Jack Kennedy, and to the very same extent his brothers, are still a beacon of hope when people pine at being in politics or want to be given a reason to go back and run and think about public service. They're still a great beacon for hope. You buy that, Bill Delahunt?
Yeah, I do. And I'm sure Tom agrees, but for me, public service was always a noble calling. And JFK epitomized that. He really inspired our generation. And I think our generation benefited, you know, from his inspiration and passed that legacy on. Because if you talk to people why they're in politics today, almost invariably they'll speak about the Kennedy impact. And that's That's a legacy.
But could somebody like that, and some of us lived through it as younger people, and obviously, so there's a little bit more of a connection. Could someone like that serve and be as he was in a time of, what, let's call it broken government like we have now? Could John Kennedy be John Kennedy?
Well, that's the great unknown. Who would have known what would have been like, you know, a year later into that administration?
Oh, I don't even mean had he lived to a second term.
Yeah.
I meant that kind of character, that kind of personality, that kind of intellect. Could he serve in this kind of dysfunctional political world and
I
prosper?
think the people from that generation really went to government more so than they do today, understanding that government is really the art of compromise, that no matter what party you come from, you've got to create progress for this democracy. You can't sit still. And I think they all saw that. And I think they respected something you don't find as well today in government. You don't respect or find the respect for the other party, the office of the presidency, the office of leader in Congress or U.S. Senate. It doesn't exist.
You know,
the best evidence is Teddy Kennedy's history in the legislature.
Who was a very close personal friend of yours, we should say.
But all during the Gingrich era, if you will, when there was bitterness and divisiveness, Ted Kennedy managed to pass significant progressive legislation. And yeah, the answer is a quick yes.
Do you think, I don't know if you ever had a discussion with Ted Kennedy about what his brother meant to him, either personally or politically, and if you did, I'd love to hear a piece of it. But obviously, Ted Kennedy was far to the left of where Jack Kennedy was on most issues. Was his dedication to public service a function of trying to continue what his brother left behind? Was there any piece of that, this unfinished business in the other part of the family? Tom, you want?
I think Bobby Kennedy played a pivotal role in the progress of what Jack Kennedy stood for, where his brother Bobby wanted it to go, and I think Ted grew from there, to be perfectly honest with you. And so there's this wonderful kind of elongation of the way it was going to be.
You're shaking your head up and down.
Yeah, I agree with what Tom just said. And you know, I think actually Ted Kennedy, when you examine his legacy, in terms of substance, it exceeds that of both of his brothers.
Well, I think most Republicans and Democrats would say one of the most accomplished senators in the history of that
But what
body.
he did it in a skillful way.
What's if there are one or two things that you say are the legacy 50 years after? I've ranged from, you know, what he might have, well, let me ask you the question rather than answer it myself. What is the legacy for Tom O'Neill of JFK?
Well, I was of the generation, and frankly, not only worked in his campaign when he ran for president, I was at the rally the last night before the election in 1960 at the Boston Garden. And the stunning thing after that was that people didn't drive home or even take the T. They walked to South Boston, or they walked to North Cambridge, or they walked back to Quincy. And it was fascinating. And to carry that spirit of the way it could be, led by a man that we all admired and loved, that's what it meant. And for our generation to come less than 10 years after that and run for the offices respectively that we did, is I think part of the legacy and part of the story about what he did to a generation of people.
So who he was and how he lived his life and the inspiration, you seem to buy that more than any legislative accomplishment.
Yeah, it's almost a continuum from the president down to Ted Kennedy's record. There's a history there, and it became more progressive as time went on. To respond to your comment about Ted being to the left of JFK, they grew. And like I said, the concrete legacy was civil rights, you know, the war, the concerns that were expressed by Robert Kennedy about Vietnam. It just went on and went forward.
That's right.
I remember I was at Middlebury College with Mike Moen, a well-known trial attorney here in Massachusetts, and my big brother at the fraternity, Ron Brown, who went on to be the Secretary of Commerce. Yeah, right. And we were at the bottom of the platform as he came down from the plane, going to the Boston Garden event. And I'll tell you, the place just went crazy. It was a moment that is etched into my psyche forever.
It's pretty clear. Bill Delahunt, yeah, quickly, if I can.
When Jack Kennedy ran and became the President of the United States, I know he had no idea his response to Martin Luther King was going to have the effect that it had on his brother, the legislation which would follow, and his second brother, Teddy, and the legislation on equity and civil rights which would follow. It's a great story.
Thanks for your recollections and your point of view, both of you gentlemen. Bill Delahunt, good to see you both.
Take care.
Thanks.